February 15th, 1988. A hospital room in Los Angeles. A man dying of cancer opens his eyes, looks at his sister, and says his final words to the world. "I'd hate to die twice, it's so boring." Not deep, not inspiring, not the peaceful acceptance you'd expect from one of history's greatest minds. And across town on a blackboard in his Caltech office, 7 words remained untouched. "What I cannot create, I do not understand." Between these two statements, one about boredom, one about creation, lies a truth so powerful it destroys everything your education taught you about learning. You spent years in classrooms, you earned degrees, you passed tests, and none of it taught you what Richard Feynman knew from the beginning. You don't understand anything you cannot rebuild from nothing. Schools never taught you this. They couldn't, because if they did, you wouldn't need them anymore. His final message wasn't a goodbye, it was an accusation against every teacher who made you memorize without understanding, of every test that rewarded repeating over creating, of every diploma that certified obedience instead of comprehension, and you believed the system. You thought passing meant learning, you thought degrees meant understanding. Feynman died knowing better, and what he left behind exposes the fraud. The lie started early. Elementary school, middle school, high school, the same pattern repeated for 12 years. Teacher talks, you listen. Teacher writes, you copy. Teacher tests, you memorize. They called this education, they measured it with grades, they certified it with diplomas, but what it really did was train you to be intellectually helpless. You can recite facts, you can reference sources, you can pass exams, but here's what schools never asked you to do. Rebuild the knowledge from scratch. Take a concept you learned and figure it out yourself using only first principles. No textbook, no notes, no formulas handed to you. Build it. You can't. And that's not an accident. Feynman spent his entire career doing exactly what schools never taught you. While other physicists memorized equations, he figured out his own. While other students copied lecture notes, he rebuilt physics in his personal notebooks. While other professors taught from established textbooks, he created new frameworks from nothing. As documented in James Gleick's biography, Genius, Feynman's approach was fundamentally different from everyone around him. He didn't trust understanding until he could create it himself. His blackboard message, found untouched after his death, was the result of 50 years proving one truth. What I cannot create, I do not understand. Not what I cannot memorize, not what I cannot repeat, what I cannot create. Schools taught you the opposite. They taught you that understanding means recognition. See the formula, remember the formula, apply the formula. That's not understanding, that's performance. And Feynman's death exposed the difference. You were cheated, not by accident, by design. Because educational systems aren't built for understanding. They're built for certification, for processing, for compliance. Real understanding, the kind Feynman demanded of himself, makes you dangerous, self-sufficient, immune to institutional authority. And that's what they trained out of you. And his final words reveal why this matters more than you realize. MIT, 1939. A 21-year-old student sits in Professor John Wheeler's quantum mechanics class. While other students frantically copy equations from the blackboard, Richard Feynman sits with a blank notebook, not taking notes. Rebuilding. Every equation Wheeler presents, Feynman figures out independently. Every concept the professor introduces, Feynman reconstructs from first principles. His classmates think he's brilliant. They're wrong. He's just refusing to fake understanding. As documented in Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, he developed this method early. He didn't trust any knowledge he couldn't recreate himself. If someone showed him a physics problem solved one way, he'd solve it 3 other ways. Not to show off, to verify he actually understood what was happening beneath the mathematics. This wasn't genius, this was discipline. The discipline to never pretend comprehension. And schools never taught you this discipline because it would break their system. Think about how you were educated. Teacher presents information, you consume it. Test arrives, you regurgitate it. Semester ends, you forget it. Then you move to the next subject and repeat the cycle. Consumption, regurgitation, forgetting for years. Feynman did the opposite. He treated every piece of knowledge like a puzzle he had to reconstruct from individual pieces. Not because the puzzle was incomplete, because reconstruction was the only proof of understanding. While schools taught you to be a container, pour information in and pour information out, Feynman taught himself to be a creator. And the difference is everything. Here's the test schools never gave you. Take any concept you learned in school, mathematics, history, science, anything. Now teach it to someone who knows nothing about the subject. But here's the constraint. You cannot reference any external source. No textbooks, no Google, no notes, just your understanding. Explain it from first principles. Derive it, build it, create it. You can't. Almost nobody can because schools never trained you to create understanding. They trained you to recognize patterns and repeat answers. That's not the same thing. And Feynman knew it from the beginning. His notebooks, hundreds of them preserved at Caltech, tell the story. He didn't take notes the way you were taught. He didn't summarize lectures or copy formulas. He built entire alternative frameworks for understanding physics. He'd encounter a concept in class, then go to his notebook and completely rebuild it using different mathematics, different visualizations, different logical paths. This is what I cannot create, I do not understand actually means, not philosophical, operational. If you cannot build the knowledge from nothing, you don't own it. You're borrowing it. And borrowed knowledge disappears the moment you need it most. But schools can't teach this because creation takes time. It takes failure. It takes the freedom to explore wrong paths and dead ends. And educational systems can't afford that. They have curricula, schedules, standardized tests, so they optimize for what can be measured quickly, memorization. They trained you to be fast and shallow instead of slow and deep, and they certified that shallowness with degrees. Feynman refused, and by the time he died, he'd accumulated a different kind of education. One built on creation, not consumption. One that couldn't be tested with multiple choice questions or certified with diplomas. One that actually worked. February 1988. The cancer had spread. Months of treatment, procedures, tests, the same hospital routines repeating in endless loops. For most people, this would be frightening, painful, tragic. For Feynman, it was boring. His sister Joan sat with him in those final days. He'd drift in and out of consciousness, extended periods of coma, brief moments of lucidity, and in one of those moments, he opened his eyes and spoke his last words. I'd hate to die twice, it's so boring. Not I love you, not I'm at peace. Not the deathbed wisdom you'd expect from someone who spent 70 years understanding the universe. Boring. The process of dying, the repetitive medical procedures, the same declining patterns, the loop of deterioration bored him. Why does this matter? Because it exposes something fundamental about how Feynman's mind worked and how different it was from what schools taught you. Boredom for Feynman wasn't about comfort or entertainment. It was intellectual. He found repetition without discovery intolerable. The same process repeating without new understanding being created. That was death to him more than physical death, intellectual death. And schools trained you to tolerate exactly that. How many hours did you sit through classes where the same information was presented the same way semester after semester? How many times did you complete homework that was just repetition without discovery? How many tests did you take that measured nothing except your ability to endure boredom? Thousands of hours, years of your life. And the system called that education. Feynman called it boring, and he'd rather die than do it again. There's a profound contradiction in his final messages, and this is where the truth emerges. On one hand, I'd hate to die twice. It's so boring. The ultimate dismissal of repetitive existence. On the other hand, a sealed letter written 16 months after his first wife, Arlene, died in 1945, discovered only after his own death in 1988. A letter he wrote to a dead woman because he couldn't stop creating emotional understanding, even in the face of rational impossibility. The letter, documented in Gleick's biography and preserved in perfectly reasonable deviations from the beaten track, was found sealed in his papers. He wrote it in October 1946, 42 years before his death, 16 months after Arlene died. And it begins, I adore you, sweetheart. He knew she was dead. He knew the letter would never be read. He wrote it anyway because understanding his love required creating its expression. Even when that expression went nowhere, even when it defied logic, this is the man who found dying boring, but spent hours writing to someone who couldn't receive the message. Not because he believed in afterlife, not because he thought she'd somehow read it, but because the act of creation, even creation that served no practical purpose, was how his mind processed understanding. Schools never taught you this. They taught you that creation needs justification, needs grades, needs external validation. Feynman created because creation was understanding. The output didn't need to serve anyone. The process served him. And this separates real learning from what they sold you. Real learning doesn't need an audience, doesn't need approval, doesn't need certification. It happens when you create understanding for yourself, by yourself, regardless of whether anyone else ever sees it. You wrote essays for grades, solved problems for points, studied for tests. Every act of learning in school was transactional. You created for external reward. And when the reward stopped, when you graduated or when the class ended, the creation stopped too. Feynman wrote to a dead woman because understanding doesn't stop when the external purpose disappears. That's the difference between genuine comprehension and scholastic performance. and his boring death paired with his intimate letter to the void exposes it. His office at Caltech remained exactly as he left it for weeks after his death. And there on the blackboard where he'd worked until days before entering the hospital, 7 words remained. What I cannot create, I do not understand. Not erased, not modified, final. And beneath it a second line. Know how to solve every problem that has been solved. And beneath that a list of topics he wanted to explore. Beta anomaly, knot theory, two-dimensional Hall effect, nonlinear classical physics. 70 years old, dying of cancer, and still building a list of things he wanted to create understanding of, not learn about, not read about, create. The blackboard is preserved now. It hangs at Caltech untouched because those 7 words contain what 12 years of compulsory education never taught you. Understanding is an act of construction, not consumption. Here's what those words actually mean. What I cannot create doesn't mean physically build. It means derive, reconstruct, explain from first principles. Take nothing on faith, accept no authority, trust no explanation until you can build it yourself using only logical foundations. I do not understand means exactly that. Not I partially understand. Not I basically get it. Not I could probably figure it out if I looked it up. Do not understand. Full stop. And this standard, creation is the sole proof of understanding, is why Feynman could do what other physicists couldn't. It's why he could explain quantum mechanics to undergraduates when other professors claimed it was too complex. It's why he could investigate the Challenger disaster in 1986 and find the O-ring failure in days when NASA engineers spent months avoiding the answer. It's why he won the Nobel Prize in 1965 for work that completely rebuilt quantum electrodynamics from scratch. Not because he was smarter than other physicists, because he held himself to a different standard, the standard written on his final blackboard. And schools never taught you that standard because it would destroy their entire model. Think about how you were evaluated in school. Multiple choice questions testing recognition, not creation. Essays graded on format and references, not original reconstruction of ideas. Math problems where you applied formulas without deriving them. Science classes where you memorized theories without rebuilding them. History courses where you recited events without analyzing the logical forces that made them inevitable. Every test, every grade, every diploma certified your ability to recognize and repeat. None of them measured your ability to create, because creation can't be standardized, can't be graded with a rubric, can't be processed through an educational system designed to handle thousands of students with limited teacher time. So they dropped the standard. They replaced understanding with something measurable, memorization. And they certified that replacement as education. Feynman's blackboard exposes this, not as philosophy, as methodology. He kept dozens of notebooks where he'd rebuild physics concepts from nothing. He'd take Einstein's relativity and derive it using different mathematics. He'd encounter quantum mechanics and create entirely new visual representations. He'd see a physics problem solved one way and force himself to solve it 3 other ways. This wasn't showing off. This was verification. The only way he trusted that he understood something was if he could create multiple independent paths to the same conclusion. If all the paths converged, the understanding was real. If they didn't, he'd keep working. Schools never asked this of you. They gave you one path, the teacher's path, and tested whether you could walk it. Not whether you understood why it led where it did, not whether you could find alternative routes, just whether you could follow directions. And that's why you can pass every test, earn every degree, and still not understand what you supposedly learned. Because following directions isn't understanding, it's compliance. And the education system optimized for compliance, not comprehension. The second line on his blackboard, know how to solve every problem that has been solved, reveals another layer. He didn't mean memorize every solution, he meant understand the methods used to solve them. Build a mental toolkit of problem-solving approaches, not formulas, approaches, logical patterns, ways of thinking that transfer across domains. Schools taught you domains, math class, science class, history class, separate subjects with separate methods. Feynman saw methods as universal. The logical approach that solves a physics problem can solve a personal problem. The mathematical framework that describes quantum mechanics can describe decision-making. The creative reconstruction that builds understanding in one field builds it in all fields. But this kind of education can't be industrialized, can't be standardized, can't be delivered to 30 students in 45-minute periods. So schools abandoned it. They gave you subject-specific formulas instead of domain-independent thinking. They trained you to ask, which formula do I use, instead of how do I create a solution, and you graduated believing that was education. That passing tests meant understanding, that degrees meant competence. Feynman's blackboard destroys that belief. Those 7 words are a measurement standard schools never gave you. It's a standard that exposes how little you actually understand. Try it. Pick something you learned in school. Anything. Now explain it to someone from pure first principles. No references, no looking things up, basically build the understanding from logical foundations. Derive it, create it. You can't. Not for most things. Because schools never trained you to create understanding. They trained you to recognize it when someone else presents it. And recognition isn't understanding. Creation over consumption. The boring death, the Blackboard Testament. These aren't separate principles. They're one system, the opposite of everything your education taught you. Feynman didn't just think differently, he operated under different rules, rules that produce different results. And schools couldn't teach those rules because they contradict the entire industrial model of education. The system needs you to believe that understanding comes from authority. Teacher knows, teacher tells, you learn. Expert writes, you read, you understand. Institution certifies, you graduate, you're competent. That's the model. And it requires you to trust external sources more than internal verification. Feynman inverted this. He trusted nothing until he could create it himself. When he won the Nobel Prize in 1965 for quantum electrodynamics, the achievement wasn't discovering something new, it was rebuilding something old in a way that made it actually comprehensible. Other physicists had the same information. They couldn't explain it. Feynman could because he'd reconstructed it from logical foundations instead of accepting it from authorities. This is what Nehao, what I cannot create, I do not understand, means in practice. Authority doesn't create understanding. Creation creates understanding. And schools systematically trained you to trust authority instead of developing creation. Every time you cited a source instead of deriving the conclusion. Every time you referenced an expert instead of reconstructing the argument. Every time you looked up an answer instead of building it from logic. You were practicing authority-based thinking. And authority-based thinking isn't thinking, it's obedience. The problem was never your intelligence. It was never your capability. It was the method they forced on you. They taught you to be a consumer of understanding rather than a creator of it. They rewarded recognition over reconstruction. They certified compliance over comprehension. And they called it education. Gave you diplomas for it. Told you it prepared you for the real world. Feynman's final blackboard proves they lied. As documented by Lawrence Krauss in Quantum Man, Feynman's approach wasn't about being brilliant, it was about being honest. He refused to pretend he understood things he couldn't create. Most people, most educated people, do the opposite. They recite information they've consumed and call it understanding. They reference sources they haven't verified. They repeat explanations they haven't reconstructed. Feynman found this intellectually dishonest, not morally wrong, intellectually empty, because borrowed understanding disappears under pressure. When you face a novel problem, memorized formulas fail. When you encounter an unexpected situation, repeated explanations don't transfer. You need actual understanding, and actual understanding only comes from creation. The sealed letter to Arlene reveals the emotional dimension of this. He wrote it because he needed to create understanding of his own love, not for her, for himself. The act of writing, of creating expression, was how he processed comprehension, even when the output served no purpose, even when it would remain sealed for 42 years. This is what schools never taught you. Creation is the process of understanding, not the product. You were trained to create for evaluation, for grades, for certification. And when those external rewards disappeared, you stopped creating because you never learned that creation serves understanding regardless of whether anyone else values the output. You write to understand what you think. You teach to understand what you know. You derive formulas to understand their meaning. You reconstruct arguments to understand their logic. The creation itself is the understanding. Everything else is performance. Feynman died understanding this. He died with a list of things he wanted to create understanding of. He died having written to a dead woman because creating expression was how he understood emotion. He died leaving 7 words on a blackboard that expose everything schools got wrong. And you were never taught this because it would make you immune to their systems. Self-sufficient, dangerous. Feynman died February 15, 1988, 70 years old, battling 2 types of cancer, months of declining health, and his final conscious contribution to the world was calling the dying process boring. Not the death itself, the repetition, the loop of deterioration without discovery. He'd rather not experience it twice, not because it was painful, because it created nothing. The man who spent 50 years proving that understanding requires creation found a process that created nothing intolerable. Even as it killed him, that's how deep the principle went. His blackboard remained 7 words that contain what schools deliberately never taught you. What I cannot create, I do not understand. The problem was never your intelligence. It was never your effort. It was the methodology they forced on you for 12 years minimum, often 16 or more. They taught you consumption and called it learning. They taught you recognition and called it understanding. They taught you compliance and called it education. You believed them. You thought passing tests meant comprehension. You thought degrees meant capability. You thought credentials meant understanding. Feynman's final message destroys that belief. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every book you read without reconstructing the argument's consumption, not understanding. Every concept you learned without deriving from first principles, recognition, not comprehension. Every skill you mastered without being able to teach it from scratch, performance, not capability. The uncomfortable truth is that most of what you think you understand, you don't. You recognize it. You can repeat it. You might even be able to apply it in familiar contexts, but you can't create it. And creation is the only standard that matters. Schools couldn't teach you this. The economics don't work. The industrial model of education requires standardization. And creation can't be standardized. It requires time, failure, and freedom. Schools have none of those. So they replaced creation with consumption and hoped you wouldn't notice the difference. You didn't until now. Feynman noticed from the beginning. He built an entire career on refusing to accept understanding he couldn't create. And when he died, he left the proof on his blackboard, not as inspiration, as instruction, as an indictment of every educational system that certified your consumption as understanding. You can't undo those years of miseducation, but you can stop pretending consumption is understanding. You can start demanding creation of yourself. That's what those 7 words mean. Not philosophy, methodology. What you cannot create, you do not understand. And you cannot create most of what you think you know. That's not your failure, that's their lie. And now you see it. The blackboard had more than those 7 words. Beneath them, know how to solve every problem that has been solved, and beneath that, a list of topics he wanted to explore before he died. Beta, anomaly, knot theory, Hall effect. Problems he wanted to create understanding of. 70 years old. Dying. Still making lists of things to rebuild from first principles because the method doesn't stop. The demand for creation doesn't pause just because death approaches. Understanding through creation was how he existed, and schools trained you to exist differently. But that second line, know how to solve every problem that has been solved, reveals another principle, another thing they never taught you. And it explains why credentials fail when real problems arrive, why experts often can't solve novel situations, why your education prepared you for tests but not for life. Because knowing how to solve every solved problem isn't about memorization, it's about methods. And methods are what schools replaced with formulas.